I am Alexie Glass-Kantor, and I am the Executive Director of Artspace Sydney, Australia, located on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nations. And it's such a privilege to be coming to you today. Artspace is located in a suburb close to Sydney Harbour, about 10 minutes walk from the Opera House, which is such a famous architectural landmark. And we're located in a suburb that is hard to spell called Woolloomooloo. We've been located in a building here on Sydney Harbour in Woolloomooloo since 1992 in a building called the Gunnery, an incredible three-story building that we've recently transformed and expanded to include expanded new galleries with an agile and responsive forward-facing program supporting Australian and international living artists to create, exhibit and present new work. We have a 250 square metre live art performance and event space for dance and happenings on our level 1 space, an incredible archive and library, a collection of 40 years of culturally diverse global publishing by curators, scholars, artists and writers. And on our top floor, we have 10 studios that we provide free to artists living and working here in Sydney, but artists can be from anywhere in the world. And that program is free 1-year residencies that we will be supporting for the next 35 years to support 350 artists. Our program is national with commissioning and co-commissioning. We work with a range of peer institutions in a global context to create new work, from the Palais de Tokyo to the Dhaka Art Summit to the ICA in London. We have a national touring program, public programs, education and outreach. And really what we are is a 40-year-old publicly funded contemporary art centre that supports new work by living artists from everywhere to tell the stories of our times.
Could you tell us about Artspace's history and significance for contemporary Australian art?
Artspace was established in 1983. This year is our 40th year. So reopening, we just reopened last weekend with an event over 3 days filled with thousands of people across the building, which was such a great celebration and a real testament to Artspace's enduring relevance for contemporary visual arts and culture in Australia. Artspace is actually one of 14 organisations around Australia called the Contemporary Arts Organisations of Australia, who represent the sort of small to medium sector, not-for-profit, non-collecting public institutions supporting the development of new work by artists. But Artspace is a really significant organisation in that in 1983, there was a flyer that was sent out, and a group of anyone was invited to join a public meeting, arts workers, collectors, artists. It wasn't just artists, it was also philanthropists, it was benefactors, it was museum directors, it was also government arts workers who came together and they had a meeting and they said, you know, Sydney really needs an art centre that does something that isn't the commercial galleries, that isn't the museums, and that isn't a festival. We need a space where artists can permanently feel supported to create artwork and to create encounters with audiences. And so Artspace was born. Our original home was in a building in central Sydney called Surrey Hills. And that building is an 1890s building, and Artspace was there for our first 10 years. And that building actually burnt down this year in a massive fire. And so the building that was our home for our first 10 years no longer exists. We moved into this building, the Gunnery, in 1992. And Artspace has been here for 30 years. We've historically lived on the ground floor with galleries and the top floor with studios, but never across all 3 floors. And we now have a major commissioning project on the facade of the building that sees 1 million people a day, and the expanded facilities across production and presentation. And I think the relevance of Artspace is in the fact it's not that we've existed for 40 years, and it's not that we've reopened today, but it's that there are artists who haven't yet been born who are going to live and work in this building, artists who come from global contexts, and who will be speaking to their stories, to their backgrounds, to the complex lived experience that can be captured and communicated through visual culture. And I think that's where Artspace maintains its relevance.
Please tell us about Artspace's revitalization and reopening.
When I started at Artspace 10 years ago, this beautiful building that we're in, that we've been in for 30 years, was not really fit for purpose. It was leaking. Did not have universal access for disability inclusion and access. It was really very run down. The building was exhausted. It was dark. It was not functional. And we were under threat of losing the building because government felt like the building was too much of a liability and that it might be better to sell the building and use that revenue to invest in other cultural programming. We did a business case that we self-funded in 2018. We'd proved that we could support studios as free. We created a book fair. We made a new project space. We created new international co-commissioning and partnerships. We increased audiences on site threefold in our touring audiences to more than 500,000 a year. And through that, government endorsed us to do a business case in 2018. So we took it to government in 2019 to do a transformation of the gunnery that we said would cost $20 million. And government laughed at us and said no. And then in 2020, we had a plan to return. And then COVID hit. And during COVID, we reduced our business case from 68 pages to 8. And we took it back to government and we said, this is a way to invest in employment, in culture as a space for healing and renewal, and by investing in cultural production, because we saw during COVID how communities stayed connected through producing content online and sharing that globally, and how when people were separated from one another, we still found a way to connect. And often that was through moving image, through performance, through singing, through dancing, through ways of thinking about physical and online connectivity. And so government, to their credit, decided to invest in this transformation for Artspace. And so we moved out of our building in August 2021 during an 18-week lockdown in Australia, where we had curfews and a 5-kilometre radius, and people were deeply isolated. And it's been the past 2.5 years that this transformation has occurred. But the learnings for us from COVID really emboldened us to create an architectural transformation of the gunnery and Artspace that was about different ways that spaces could operate to hold communities. So I think the future for art spaces globally, not just Artspace Sydney, but for contemporary art centres in a global context, will be thinking about partnerships, inclusion as an active principle, doing the kind of labour that we learn from artists about making structural advocacy visible, and how we create spaces that are agile, that don't do one thing. And I think we're seeing great leadership from philanthropists, particularly, and private collections in a global context, who are really building, great art centers across India, across the Philippines, across China, across Korea. And there's really great learnings that can be taken through partnerships that exist in the public and private sector to create new collaboration and points of meeting.
Please tell us more about the exhibition Untitled, Transcriptions of Country.
Artspace is reopening with an exhibition by Wiradjuri and Camilla Roy artist Jonathan Jones. The exhibition is called Untitled, Transcriptions of Country and has been 5 years in the making. It's an expansive exhibition that takes as its departure point the circumnavigation of Australia by a man called Nicolas Baudin. He was sent at the behest of Napoleon to race the British because they thought that there was a channel in the middle of Australia and the British would take half and the French the other half. But that didn't turn out to be the case. But Baudin was actually sent on a slightly different mission than the British. His boat included botanists, scientists, astronomers, composers, artists, and archivists. And part of their mission was not just to conquer and colonize Australia, but part of their mission was to collect and to document the continent of Australia and its people and its flora and its fauna. And Jonathan is a really interesting Aboriginal artist who is interested in exploring how the colonial project actually can create and contribute to archives that can be examined to create new forms of sovereignty or learning about Aboriginal culture. In this project, there's actually 308 embroideries of Indigenous plants that were collected by Baudin. He collected more than 300 Indigenous plant samples on his mission that he took back to the Malmaison the summer home of Josephine, but also to the Jardin in France, one of the largest collections of Australian Indigenous plants in the world. And we sent Jonathan to France in 2018 to research the archive. And he actually printed on linen an outline of every plant and its registration number. And during COVID, we worked with a group of 17 migrant women from Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, to work also with a queer collective called Adorned. And we worked with Aboriginal knowledge holders over 18 months to translate every plant sample collected by Baudin into a monochrome embroidery. And we've made a 500-page book which indexes every plant and its story, its use for food, for culture, for ritual. And that was a really amazing project. We raised the funds to pay every collaborator for their embroidery. And for some of these migrant community collaborators, for some of the women particularly, it was a source of income for their families during COVID and actually provided support for community. And we really think socially engaged practice means that artists should be remunerated for their labor. This project has a beautiful film. Baudin actually witnessed a ceremony in Australia for Aboriginal people called a corroboree or a jumba, and they recorded the first annotated versions of language, which Jonathan translates with a Narenti woman, Lily Madden, the granddaughter of a very famous Aboriginal civil rights leader called Charles Perkins. And he made the film with a Wiradjuri Aboriginal poet and artist, Jazz Money. There's a series of boomerangs and shields made from porcelain, carved emu eggs, and there was a series of 6 portraits that were done of Aboriginal people by an artist called Nicola Petit, who was on the Baudin mission. And they were the first images of Aboriginal people not as terra nullius, which is what the British had declared Australia. And these portraits were sold to the French as lithographs, as souvenirs of Napoleon's great kind of, colonial journeys. And these portraits Jonathan has framed, and he's made individual wreaths that circle them, made of paper daisies, emu eggs, black swan feathers, and possum fur. This exhibition actually premiered at the Palais de Tokyo in 2021. Artspace, over the past 10 years, we've been working with peer institutions in 17 countries to work on a series of more than 10 co-commissions to support solo exhibitions, working with the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh, working with ICA London, working with Performer in New York. And this most recent edition with the Palais has now returned to Artspace in an expanded form. We've made a 500-page book that documents each one of the plants and all of the collections from Baudin, along with 17 contributions by Aboriginal writers. And the exhibition will now tour to more than half a dozen venues across Australia. So we wanted to open with this exhibition because it looks at a different lens at how the absence of the repatriation of objects or material collected from the British and French colonies can be repatriated through a different way of investigating collaboration, object making, moving image, and exhibition through First Nations and Aboriginal leadership.
Please tell us how Untitled reflects Jonathan's earlier light installation works.
I've been working with Jonathan for over 20 years. I first began working with him on a series of neon works that he did, where he was looking at the history of scar trees in Australia, which was a way of Aboriginal mark making in the landscape, to look at care and cultivation of country through ritual, through renewal, through backburning. And he had an interesting language very early in his career, where Jonathan's work was really looked at through the language of Aboriginal practices in relationship to conceptual practice and minimalism, particularly to conceptual and contemporary art that came out of a mid-20th century language of abstraction and the reduction of form. And he was very interested in how the mark making of particularly Wiradjuri Aboriginal people connected to histories of conceptual and critical mark making in contemporary art and visual culture. I think over the years, Jonathan's practice has evolved to think about how forms that are made, how material forms can be translated into something that is essential, how everything that is not essential to an object or an idea becomes removed from the process of presentation and encounter for audience. With the embroideries in this particular exhibition, every one of the 308 plant samples is embroidered in black thread. So interpreting the detail, nuance, and texture of the facsimile of a plant that was collected more than 200 years ago, and then retranslated by people who are learning about those plants and sharing stories with Aboriginal knowledge holders into something monochrome, into something essential, into something that becomes almost like a shadow, is quite beautiful, and how you create texture from reducing something to its most essential material form. And I feel that Jonathan's practice is one where he uses extensive research, knowledge, and commitment to thinking about archives, history, and culture. And then he finds ways of collaborating with people or material from the archive to take what's necessary to create something that's very powerful in its ambition, and its the volume and weight of the material that he works with hold space. But there's actually something that is absolutely essential about everything he does. And I feel that that role of light in his work over the past 2 decades is not just about the use of light in its kind of affect and form through installation, but the way in which he casts light into archives, into history, into language, into knowledge, into storytelling. And I think Jonathan is one of the most remarkable artists working in our region today.
How does Jonathan Jones's Untitled and Artspace's program connect to Sydney's colonial history?
Untitled Transcriptions of Country is an expansive and incredible and ambitious exhibition in its layered interrogation of portrait making, the collection of objects and plants, and the repatriation of language. Jonathan is actually making a major public work for the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney Modern, just 5 minutes walk from us up the hill, where he's actually creating a garden that will be backburned every 12 to 18 months live on the site of the museum. It's been a very complex and difficult work to realize, probably one of the most ambitious works of public art ever to be realized, I would argue, in Australia. For a museum to commission a work that involves the burning of a garden, as would be part of Indigenous and First Nations practices prior to colonisation, in order to renew the landscape as part of care for the landscape, is a big challenge and will be a remarkable work. And this exhibition at Artspace really connects to that public project and has a conversation about climate, about environment, about how Indigenous and First Nations knowledges can be really understood as a way of caring for the environment, to maybe think about climate justice and the environment in a different way. We actually have a project on the facade of our building here at the Gunnery, a new commissioning project called the Banner Series. And the first banner has been done by a young Aboriginal artist, a Kamilaroi artist called Dennis Golding. So Jonathan is not the only Aboriginal artist in our program at this time. Dennis is on the facade with a work that looks at the history of Victorian architecture that was often used for social housing for Aboriginal communities in the early and throughout the 20th century. And we have a work on our facade that looks at the retranslation of how the British interpreted Indigenous plants and how that can be repatriated through the work of Aboriginal artists. And in our studio program, we have 2 Aboriginal artists, an artist Thea and Amara Perkins, an Arenti and Kalkadoon painter, and a poet and artist, a Wiradjuri poet and artist, Jazz Money, who's doing really remarkable work. Artspace, like many cultural organisations in Australia in recent years, has developed a reconciliation action plan, which looks at how we can be led by First Nations knowledges. And we're very privileged to have the Aboriginal artist Daniel Boyd on our board of directors, and to be really working to be led by protocols that focus on recognition of the enduring cultural legacies of First Nations and Aboriginal people to Australia and its histories. And when you work as a cultural space in Australia, it's not something you can do in a tokenistic way. It has to be embedded, which is why artists like Dennis, Jonathan, Jazz, and Thea appear throughout our program at this time. But when Artspace opened back in the 1980s, one of our mission and visions was to connect with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists and their leadership. And some of the earliest exhibitions at Artspace in 1984 was an Aboriginal show called Koori 84. Another of our priorities was to look at gender equity through LGBTQI+, and to look at gender representation, and also to look at cultural and linguistic diversity at the diverse communities that underpin Australia. And we now have a fully accessible archive and library that can make accessible to audiences 40 years of publishing, which actually looks at Aboriginal and First Nations connections to a shifting social, cultural, and political landscape, not just in Australia, but globally.
What would you like audiences to take away from the exhibition?
With audiences returning to a transformed art space, what we would love them to take away is an invitation to return. We really want audiences to know that when they come to the art space, that not every exhibition is going to be the same as every other exhibition, that we'll be working with artists from diverse cultural contexts, locally, nationally, and internationally, and that what they will see at Artspace will be rigorous, intensive, thought-provoking, textured, and generous exhibitions that really do and reach different audiences in different ways. And we're really excited for audiences to come here. We have these beautiful windows. We have a new double height void that opens onto a plaza. We've reoriented the building, and we'll have music and dancing. In January, we've got an Aboriginal writer, Daniel Browning, launching a book, and we've got the South African artist, DJ, and curator, Mo Laudi, coming to perform a 2-hour sonic dance lecture looking at histories of slavery through emancipation of bodies in movement. We will be having really beautiful public programs with Jonathan's collaborators who made the embroideries, workshops for children. And what we really want audiences to take away from the reopening is a sense that Artspace is here for them, and that this will be a place where they can always meet artists.
What's next for you?
As a curator, working for over 25 years, I've really long been interested in the role and place that Australia could play in a conversation in the region. For me, I think Asia is Turkey to Hawaii. And if that is Asia, then Australia has a responsibility to participate, not as a British colony and not as the 53rd state of America, but has like an opportunity to be more generous in the way that it listens to our neighbours and listens to the culturally diverse communities who live here in this incredible place. And so shows like 52 Artists, 52 Actions, where we commissioned an artist a week from across Asia to enact a socially engaged or political action that we broadcast on Instagram, was a remarkable project. We worked with artists from 38 countries from their 20s through to their 80s to create a project that really explored art as action from across Asia. And we did a second edition of that project during COVID, where we commissioned 52 artists from across remote and urban and regional Australia to do 52 actions as a way of remunerating them during lockdown and to create community connection at a time of isolation. And that show is now touring as a physical exhibition before returning to Artspace. And shows like Unlearning Australia at Seoul Museum of Art, which really looked at how the breadth and diversity of Australian artists working from remote and urban regional Australia could collect with practices of learning and unlearning. What's next for us is we have an exhibition opening in March at Ocean Space in Venice as part of the TBA 21 program. Artspace, together with TBA, which is the Thyssen-Bornemisza Art Foundation, and they have a space in Venice dedicated to climate justice, looking at water. We've commissioned an artist, Taloy Havini, from Bougainville in the Pacific to curate an exhibition that will be looking at sea country and custodianship and care of sea country. That exhibition will open in Venice in March and will run through La Biennale, and then we'll come back to Artspace in December next year with performances, public programs, and engagement. We are hoping to reinitiate another edition of 52 Actions, a global edition, to understand how social media works with socially engaged practice. And we will be working on collaborative projects with peer institutions like the Dhaka Art Summit, and continuing to work in Hong Kong and the Philippines and across the region with commissioning and presenting new works by artists living and working in the region, and inviting scholars and academics to participate in our public programs and research, as well as hosting public programs as well that can connect different audiences. For me, I think if Australia, we should be a place that welcomes discussion by our diverse audiences and communities, and that welcomes and supports the production and presentation and commissioning of new works, particularly by those from across the region. And so we're excited to see what next. With 35 years in the building secure, we don't have to do everything today, but we will definitely be doing it tomorrow.